For over 1,400 years, a single book has carried a monumental claim that it has remained perfectly preserved, letter for letter, since the 7th century. But is that claim a historical reality or a foundational myth? How can we be sure the Quran we hold today is the same one recited by the first Muslims? Today, we bring together a historian, a scientist, and a theologian to tackle this very question. They'll dig into ancient records and forgotten manuscripts, and what they find challenges our modern assumptions about how a text can be preserved. This is a story of textual criticism and belief, and it might just change how you see this ancient book. Welcome. We're joined by 3 experts from very different fields. Dr. Aris Thorne, a historian specializing in late antiquity and the rise of Islam. Dr. Lena Petrova, a paleographer who uses cutting-edge science to analyze ancient texts. And Imam Malik Hassan, a theologian and scholar of Quranic sciences. Dr. Thorne, let's start with you. From a historian's perspective, what's the core challenge when we talk about preserving a text for this long?
The core challenge is time itself and human fallibility. Preserving any text across 1.5 millennia is an immense task. We have to go back to 7th century Arabia, a predominantly oral society. Poetry, history, genealogies, these were primarily carried in people's minds. From a secular historian's viewpoint, this is an inherently fragile method of transmission. The Quranic revelation, delivered over 23 years, was first and foremost a spoken text, learned by the Prophet Muhammad's followers. When the Prophet passed away in 632 CE, the Quran didn't exist as a single bound book. It existed in the memories of hundreds of followers and in fragmented written form on various materials, parchment, palm leaves, even the shoulder blades of camels. This presents a major historical problem. How do you consolidate a text that is so widely scattered, both in memory, which is prone to error, and in unofficial, fragmented writings? This question became a crisis right after the Prophet's death, during the Battle of Yamama. A large number of the most accomplished Quran memorizers, the Hufaz, were killed. For the early Muslim community, this sparked a logistical fear that parts of the revelation could be lost as the people who carried it died. This was the critical moment that prompted the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, to consider a formal compilation. The key question was how to get from this crisis to a single, authoritative book.
Dr. Thorne has laid out the crisis well. The loss at Yamama was the catalyst for formally gathering the Quran into a single volume, a mushaf. To understand the traditional account of how this was achieved, you have to grasp the 2 pillars of preservation that were central to the early community, one oral, one written. From a theological perspective, Muslims believe the Quran contains a divine promise of its own protection. This promise, it is believed, was fulfilled through a practical human-driven method. The first and most crucial pillar was Hifz, or memorization. This was a rigorous discipline. The Prophet encouraged his followers to learn verses by heart and would review their recitation. This established what's known as an isnad, an unbroken chain of transmission, where a student learns from a teacher who learned from their teacher, tracing back to the Prophet. Because the Quran was central to daily prayers, it was constantly recited and cross-referenced by the community. An error made by one individual would ideally be corrected by others who knew the same passage. It was intended to be a living text, safeguarded by mass communal memory.
And that oral tradition is a key part of the narrative, but as a scientist, I look for testable physical evidence. Even the most robust oral tradition is susceptible to memory drift over generations. That's where the second pillar, the written record, becomes critical. While the primary mode was oral, the Prophet had appointed scribes to write down revelations. So, A written tradition was developing in parallel to the oral one. The project initiated by Abu Bakr and later standardized by the third Caliph, Uthman, was an act of compilation and verification. The lead scribe, Zayd ibn Thabit, was instructed to gather all known written fragments and verify every verse against the memories of the leading memorizers. A verse was reportedly only included if it was backed by both written evidence and oral testimony, creating a system of checks and balances. This is where science gives us insight. We can analyze early manuscripts. The Birmingham Quran manuscript, for example, was radiocarbon dated with 95.4% accuracy to between 568 and 645 CE. The Prophet lived from about 570 to 632 CE. This means the parchment comes from an animal that was alive during the Prophet's lifetime or shortly after. The text on these fragments is legible and shows remarkable similarity to the Quran read today, which supports the historical account of an early written tradition.
What we're seeing is a unique, two-part system of preservation being put to the test. If you're finding this analysis insightful, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. It helps us bring more deep dives like this to you. Now, let's get to the complex findings these experts have uncovered.
What's striking from a historical perspective is the deliberate nature of this process. Other ancient traditions had strong oral transmission, and others had sacred written texts. But the systematic effort to weave them together on a large scale was significant. The oral tradition wasn't just for an elite priesthood, it was for the masses. The written text wasn't a secret document, it was meant for public verification. This stands in contrast to the textual history of many other scriptures. However, we need to properly define preservation. The Uthmanic project, around 650 CE, was a deliberate act of standardization. Caliph Uthman had become concerned that as the empire expanded, regional variations in pronunciation and even slight differences in wording were emerging. He commissioned an official master copy and sent it to major cities, reportedly ordering that other personal non-standardized copies be destroyed to unify the community around a single verified text. This itself is an admission that variations existed.
Exactly. And the evidence from manuscripts like the Sana'a Palimpsest in Yemen complicates the story of perfect preservation. A palimpsest is a manuscript where the original text was scraped off and written over. The top layer of text on the Sana'a manuscript is a standard Uthmanic Quran. But using ultraviolet light, we can read parts of the erased lower text. That lower text contains significant variance from the standard version, different word choices, scribal errors, and even a different order of some chapters. Some critics see this as definitive proof the Quran was altered. From a textual critic's perspective, it's physical proof of the very textual diversity that Caliph Uthman's project aimed to eliminate. It shows us what some pre-standardized versions looked like and demonstrates that the standardization project was both real and necessary from the state's point of view. The key insight isn't that some secret Quran existed. It's the physical evidence that a single, perfectly stable text from the very beginning is a simplistic view. The process involved selection and the suppression of competing textual variants.
And that brings us to the core of the discussion. For believers, this process is seen as the fulfillment of the Quran's promise of its preservation. The variants found in the lower Sana'a manuscript are interpreted not as equally valid versions of the Quran, but as early personal copies or study notes which contain the errors and memory lapses that the formal compilation was designed to filter out. The meticulous human effort of the Prophet's companions, the political will of the caliphs, and the devotion of millions of memorizers are seen as the mechanism of that preservation. The story isn't about a book that was magically shielded from history. It's about a text protected by a unique system of oral and written transmission that was then deliberately standardized. The goal was to create a stable, unified text, and by all accounts, that effort was incredibly successful.
So, has the Quran remained intact and unchanged? The answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. The evidence points to a text that has been remarkably stable and well preserved since the 7th century Uthmanic standardization. However, the journey to that standard text involved a process of unifying regional variations and selecting one version over others that existed in the early community. The revelation from the manuscripts is the system itself, a mutually reinforcing process of oral and written transmission that stabilized a text early in its history, a process that has few, if any, parallels. The Quran we read today is the direct descendant of that Uthmanic project. What are your thoughts on this evidence? Do the early textual variants challenge the claim of divine preservation, or do they simply reveal the human process through which the text was unified? Let us know your take in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who might find it interesting. Thanks for watching.